Greetings and welcome to our VAST customer training webinar. Great to have you all here as you're coming in and getting settled. I'll introduce myself. I'm Kristen Thompson, Director of Customer Education here at VAST. And this is one of our series that we do on helping our customers understand everything that they need to know as admins of the VAST management system. And this session today is really one of our beginning foundational ones. It's great for if you're new to the VAST management system, or if you've been around for a while but you want to refresh, make sure you've wrapped your head around all the different aspects of the VAST management system and navigating in the GUI, so on and so forth. So that's what we're going to cover today. Before we really jump in, I am going to also let you know we have a lab guide you can use to get into a hands-on lab where you can click around and follow along with instructions to test it out for yourself. So I'll put those in the chat in a minute. Another exciting opportunity we have coming up is in February, we have a user conference, VAST's first user conference that we're doing called VAST Forward. And that is going to be a great opportunity to come in for a few days. There'll be training involved as well as keynotes. So you will actually be able to be in the room doing hands-on keys, getting fully trained, walking away with something to show that you have gone through this training and so on and so forth. So we'd love to have you there. I'll put the link to the chat in that for the chat as well. And with that is my little preamble. I'm going to invite our wonderful presenter, Phil Wagstrom, onto the stage. He is going to be leading you through this session as he has many times. We were joking before that this is really on our greatest hits of the topics that Phil covers. So looking forward to you all getting to hear this. And with that, I'll let you take over, Phil.
All right, sounds good. Thanks, Kristen. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. So I'm Phil Wagstrom, the office of the CTO here at VAST, and today we're going to be going and talking about VMS, what VMS is, how we interface with it, basically how it's laid out, and the kinds of activities we can do with it. So with that, let's just dive right into it. I'm going to go through, share out my screen here, and we will get started. All right, so let's start with that screen there. All right. So now, with VMS, as I said, we're gonna talk about what it is and how it operates here. Let's see here. Is this? Hold on a second here. Okay, good. There we go. All right. Got a warning up there saying it was taking too long to display things out. Not sure what that was about. All right. So let's go through a VMS overview. So we're going to cover again. What is VMS? What does it do? What's its role in the VAST cluster? What kind of activities does it handle? We're going to talk about the different VMS interfaces. So we're going to talk about how we interact with it, how we make use of the GUI, how we make use of the command line, how we make use of the API. We'll go a little bit into the access management controls. So we'll talk about the differences between a tenant admin and a cluster admin, along with methods to go through and control and limit those users' access. If you want to use some role-based access control to delegate certain rights to certain individuals. And then we'll conclude with a GUI overview, because that honestly is the most common method that folks will go through and use to interface with a VAST cluster. So let's dig into VMS. So kind of an overview of the VAST data management platform, or the VAST AI operating system, is that we are an API first architecture. What that means is that anything we do within the GUI, within the command line, are ultimately all API calls. We can go through and we can control a complete VAST cluster with creating views and shares and fit pools and databases and all the other good stuff there. We can do all that strictly through API calls. Optionally, if you want, we can make use of what we refer to as VAST uplink. This is an optional feature there where we can go through and you can have multiple VAST clusters going to a single cloud interface to provide you with a single pane of glass for all the clusters in your environment. VMS itself collects thousands of metrics on the cluster. These will range from not only your typical, I/O statistics, latency and bandwidth, but also statistics related to user utilization and storage and where I/O is coming from. We'll collect all of those as well. And then VMS will provide you with capacity management on the system, as well as real-time data flows for looking at the analytics of the system to get information about where data is flowing, how it's flowing, where the bottlenecks might be on your system. So let's talk about VMS. So what is VMS? VMS stands for the VAST Management System. It is a process. It is a service that runs on one of the C nodes. So if in your typical VAST cluster here, in a very simplistic view of things, we have our C nodes in the front end. These are compute nodes that present out that handle the protocol side of things and present data out to your clients. And then in the back end, we have our D boxes and D nodes that contain all of the flash for this. Now, VMS will run on any one of the C nodes in the cluster. This means that we'll select a C node, VMS will start up on that C node. If that C node fails, it'll automatically restart on another C node. Now, for smaller clusters, meaning those that have less than 16 C nodes, VMS will just run alongside the data services that are running on that particular C node. However, once we get past 16 C nodes, that actually there's a lot of management that we want to go through and do, a lot of statistics we want to go through and collect. So we'll start dedicating a single C node to running just that. When we say dedicate a C node, that just basically means that VMS will run exclusively on that C node. That C node is not going to be participating on ingesting I/O. It may be doing other things for background processes, but it's not handling the client protocols. VMS is responsible, again, for monitoring the cluster. So when there's an alert or there's a hardware failure or an event that happens, cable is unplugged, we restart a C node, we're doing the updates, it will be the one that will go through and send out those notifications. Again, it's also responsible for all the performance metrics. So the VMS instance will go through and pull the cluster statistics or the node statistics from every component and every node in the cluster, and then aggregate those and present those out with it. Now, VMS itself really has three common interfaces, though ultimately, as I mentioned before, these all boil down to the REST API. But we provide a GUI interface, so a web browser-based interface, or VCLI, which is a command line interface. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then also the API interface. And like other services here, we'll provide a single IP address for VMS. So regardless of where VMS is running, which C node it's running on, we're going to have a single IP address that we're going to interface with to the cluster. And as that moves around, as VMS moves around in the cluster, that VMS IP address will move with it, so we don't have to worry about where it is, where exactly it's running on. Now, the one thing with this that I'm going to go through and point out is that VMS itself is responsible for providing that management interface. However, it is not critical for cluster functionality. So if we have a situation where we take down a C node for normal things like doing upgrades, when we do our non-disruptive upgrades on the cluster, we have to go through and update VMS. We have to go through and take down the C nodes to update the software on those. Having VMS shut down and restart is a non-impactful event to cluster I/O. It's responsible, again, just for the management interface, not for the cluster functionality. So if VMS is down, the cluster will still happily function taking any I/O, but until VMS restarts, we just don't have a management interface to go through and interact with to create things like new views and exports and view policies and monitoring for them. So it's not critical. It's okay to go through and take down if we have maintenance events that need to be done. But normally it'll go down, restart on something else pretty relatively quickly. So let's go through and let's dig in now into the VMS interfaces, the primary interfaces that we use to administer a VAST cluster. So the most common one is the VMS GUI, and we'll spend some more time on this here, but you go through and you use your typical web browser to go through. You go through, you hit it, you log in with your VMS administrator account. Again, with VAST, there is a separation of the management plane and the data plane. So just because you have access on the storage side does not mean you have access on the management side. The management users are handled and controlled separately. They come from the same name service source, like Active Directory, so you're able to use your Active Directory credentials, but they are separate. Again, just because you have access to the management interface doesn't mean you have access to the data interface or vice versa. But when you go through, you hit this single VMS IP address with your web browser, and you're presented with a login screen there. We do provide two separate interfaces. This is a change coming with that came with 5.3, is that we now have an interface for cluster administrators and tenant administrators. And we'll talk about what the differences between those two notions are in a little bit here. So kind of an example here of what the GUI looks like for a cluster administrator. We'll get cluster-wide views on things. We'll see things like our alerts and activities. We'll get over your capacity and a high-level performance from this initial dashboard that we have. Tenant administrators here are going to get a little different view of things, where they don't necessarily see the entirety of the hardware because they're managing just a tenant, not the entirety of the cluster, but they'll be able to see things related to their own cluster. So we'll show that again here in a little bit. Now, the next item for this, the next interface is a VCLI interface, or the VAST command line interface. Now, the VCLI interface is not something really that we can use for scripting. It's more managed. Someone described it to me at one point as a TUI, or a text-based user interface, which it really is. You can go through, and in order to access the VCLI, you have to have SSH access into one of the C nodes on the cluster. When you log into one of the C nodes, you can issue the command VCLI for that, and that will execute this VCLI interface. Very well designed. It has things like auto completion, and will give you suggestions for the last command that you ran for this. Very, very useful. But again, with VCLI here, it's not really designed as a scripting something you can go through and script against. Again, because you have to, number one, you have to log in to SSH into the C node as the VAST data user first, and then run VCLI, connect up that way. And then, it's more like a text-based user interface. There is some scripting you can do with it, but it's not, when most people hear scripting, it's not quite what they're looking for. But we have other ways of doing that. So we also have, again here, everything ultimately boils down to the REST API. So the GUI and VCLI all are making these calls to the REST API. And if you're curious to know what kind of calls are being made and you're working through the GUI interface, if you call up the development tools within your browser to go through, you can actually see the browser interface as it goes through and makes these API calls when you're doing just regular GUI commands. You can actually see the APIs being called. Now, within VAST, we can look at the types of API calls that we want, because we do have built-in documentation. If you go to the VMS IP/docs, you'll be presented with the API documentation for the version of the cluster that you are going through and running. Now, we also have this available from our support page for this. So if you go to support.vastdata.com, from there, you can go through and see this same information, and we can go through and look at different versions of the API docs for that. So very useful to go through. If I say I want to look at, well, what's the endpoint for, I want to create a view, what's the endpoint, what the parameters I can go through and set, what's the expected output, we can go through and give you that information there. There is a Swagger interface. Swagger interface is the VMS IP/API. You can log into the Swagger interface and execute commands directly from there. For that, the one thing I will caution about the API interface is that it is dynamically generated as it goes. So if there's a lot of endpoints from the area that you're looking at, it may take a few seconds to go through and populate. But it is a very powerful thing if you want to go through and use the API, use the Swagger interface to go through and do things. There is also available to us off of our GitHub page. That's github.com/vast-data is the URL. There's a Python SDK, which we use to facilitate the interfaces into the REST API if you want to do Python scripting. But I point this out specifically because there is a utility included with the SDK called VAST CLI. And this interface is very useful for scripting. So with the VAST CLI interface, we can go through, we can either run things from locally without having to log in directly to one of the C nodes. We can run this locally on your desktop, or really any machine that has access or can route to the VMS IP address. and run various different commands. The format's going to be different than VCLI because it does rest on the API. So rather than running command in VCLI like show views, the VAST CLI will be VAST CLI get space views because we're doing a get command against the views endpoint for that. But we can go through and do all of those things there. And this is something that is available not only to cluster administrators, but also tenant administrators. So really anyone that has access to the management interface and can log into the management interface can make use of this utility. It's very, very powerful, very, very nice to go through and use. So I've talked a little bit about cluster and tenant admins, and this is let's dig into that. Let's dig into how we control management and access to VMS. So with VAST 5.3, which was released earlier in the summer here, we introduced the concept of a tenant administrator. And what a tenant administrator is it basically allows you to delegate administrative functions to different groups and limit what they have available, what they have visibility to see and manipulate. Prior to 5.3, there were some interfaces to go through and do that through the API, but the GUI really wasn't designed to go through and handle it. 5.3 fixes all of it. So within VMS now, we have the notion of a cluster administrator and a tenant administrator. If we want to log in, both the cluster administrator and a tenant administrator have different endpoints for this, or different GUI URLs that they can go through and use. The basic difference between a tenant admin and a cluster admin is that a cluster admin has visibility to cluster-wide resources. They can go through and they can create things like create things like VIP pools and modify VIP pools and attach name service providers and set up peering relationships for things like replication. But these are cluster-wide resources in addition to going through and doing hardware administration and upgrades and things like that. Tenant administrators are going to be limited to just resources that are supplied to their tenant. So they will, a tenant admin will have the ability to create views and view policies and quotas and lifecycle rules within their tenant for that, but they won't have the ability to go through and, let's say, change the networking within that tenant, because the networking is a cluster-wide resource and tenants only have the ability to manage what they have locally there. So a little different interfaces for those different delegation of responsibilities. So let's go through and let's kind of dig into what how we control some of those rules in roles within the cluster. So within VMS does have role-based access controls for this, both for cluster administrators as well as tenant administrators. And what these roles are is that they basically will go through and they're broken up into what we refer to as realms, meaning the areas that you have the ability, or the types of objects, the types of components that we want to go through and administer, along with the activities that you want to be able to do. So if I want to go through and I want to work with hardware, well, there's going to be the notion of a C node is part of that, and a D node is part of that, and the SSDs are part of that. And then there is, do I want to be able to create, which we can grow a cluster by adding C nodes? Do I want to be able to lead or admin or do things like that? So we can define those kind of roles there. Ultimately, we go through and we create a role. We have to say, is this for a cluster admin or is this for a tenant admin? And we can define those from there, which tenants that this applies to, which ones they don't. And with this as well is that if you are integrated into Active Directory for your provider and you enable the provider as a VMS authentication source for those, we can then go through and assign certain groups within Active Directory or LDAP to administer or make use of these roles and administer VMS. If you're not tied into that, then these can all be done with locally defined managers, locally defined administrators on that. So we've got flexibility with how we want to go through and do that. Now, there are several default roles that are defined. These are defined at the cluster level. So these are all cluster admin default roles. They're going to be administrator, configuration, CSI, debug metrics, or read-only role for those. We can't delete the default roles. They have to be there, but we can go through and do some modification, like adding additional LDAP groups to those or Active Directory groups. And we can definitely generate additional roles if we want to customize how we want things. Now, within these realms here, let's talk about what these different realms are very briefly. These realms are broken up into events, hardware, logical, monitoring, security, settings, and support. Each one of those covering a pretty broad area for things. So typically, you're going to need parts for multiple realms to accomplish what you want. When I say you're going to need parts for multiple realms, you may need a portion of the hardware realm or the logical realm, or let's say logical and security, to go through and do things like create identity policies and create S3 user keys and create views sometimes and view policies because they're going to be pulling from different areas. Things like VIP pools, they're going to be under the logical area. If I want to look at users and do lookups of users to be able to assign identity keys and manipulate those users to remove S3 identity keys or S3 access keys from those users, that falls under the security portion of it. So you may be part of multiple roles here, but the roles here are pretty broad, and we may want to have a little more granular control over what types of things somebody is able to go through and do. And we do allow for this there. We got the ability to create what we refer to as custom realms. And custom realms allow us to be very, very granular as to what we want a user to be able to go through and do. So let's say if I wanted to create a user that is just, or I want to create a role for somebody who's just responsible for administering quotas, for a system. I could create a custom realm that just says quotas or quota admin, and I would go through and look at the logical realm here, and I would say, hey, I want to get a quota entity info, I want to get a user quota portion and then a quota object for those, and that would be what they're allowed to go through and administer. So we can create these custom realms as we need for those. Gives us a lot of flexibility. And again, when we go through and create a role, the role is going to be able to pull things from various different realms. From that. So it doesn't have to be in the single realm. It could be from multiple realms. Now, if we are looking at logging in here, let's talk about how we go through and log into the cluster and kind of go through things here. So I could stick with the slides here, but I found this always a little better if we see this kind of in action here as to how we go through and log into VMS. So I'm going to drop from the slides here. We're going to kind of go down into just go through into a live demo here of things and just kind of walk through the different areas within the cluster. So when I want to go through and I want to connect up to a VAST VMS cluster, again, actually, let's step back here. Let's touch on the things I've already gone through kind of as a review. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. But, so with VMS, again, we have the GUI interface, we have an API interface, we have a VCLI interface or a command line interface. So let's touch them. So we have our GUI interface. We're going to delve into that just momentarily here. If we go to /docs, this gives us our API documentation endpoints, and I can go through and look at this. Let's say I want to look at the element store. I want to say, hey, I want to look at views. I can come down and find under element store here, and I can go through and look at my views here. Let's say I want to know what do I need to do to create a view. These are the different types of components that I would need or type of information I can go through and provide to the view. That gives a very basic Python code example here. I found these to be, unfortunately, a little bit too basic to be of much use, but it does give a basic interface, a basic example there. If we will go out to the VAST public site, we have the same documentation for this as well. It will default to the latest release, which today is 5.3, but there are older versions of the API docs there as well that we can go through. If I want to see what has changed between my versions there, I can go through and look at these as well. And again, this is off our public site. And again, our VAST API, our Swagger interface here. If I go to /API here, this gives us our Swagger interface. I can do things like I can log in as a user and go through and execute commands directly off of this. And then again, the last portion of this for the API is our Python SDK, which this is the VAST-Py SDK that we're looking for here. So if we go through and we click on that, we're going to be able to pull this down. Very easy install. Pip install VAST-Py goes along with any Python packages that you already have for that. And then we've got a lot of information here as to how we can go through and use it. And the interesting part of this here, again, is going to be the VAST CLI interface. So let's talk about that in just a moment. For an example here for the VAST CLI interface, let's kind of show you how you log into that very briefly. So I have for here, I'm logged into just my desktop here. I'm going to SSH into one of the CNOs. I have this aliased out. We've got multiple clusters in our lab. I have this aliased out. But what this does is it's going to go through and say, hey, I'm going to log in as VAST data, and this is one of the IP addresses, one of the CNOs, one of the management IP addresses of one of the CNOs in this cluster. So I'm going to log into that as a VAST data user. I get presented with a regular Linux prompt for this, and I need to execute VAST VCLI. This gives me my VCLI interface there. It does prompt me for my username and password because this is now interfacing with VMS, so I need to provide that information. I'm going to use my default VMS admin user and password, provide that, and I get this nice command line interface here. It is, again, very well documented. So if I type help, it gives me all the commands here for these that I can go through and run. It also, if I'm running a particular command here, I can do, let's say, view list. Here it gives me, does command line completion, gives me all of this here. Now, the one criticism I have here for VCLI is that it is very verbose. When I do a view list, it gives me all the default information on all of the views. If I want to go through and do something here, let's say path, I can restrict things down a bit and get information about just my path here, but it does give me all the fields for it. So you may have to I found myself always going really, really wide for the window that I'm using, but that's not a too hard of a thing to go through and do. Now the VCLI interface here, this is again another interface that we can go through and use, and the VCLI interface is going to be basically makes use of the API commands. The format's going to be a little bit different here. So let's say I want to look at my views. I would use a command very similar to something like this, where I do VAST CLI get views. Again, we're going to do a get command against the view endpoint, and I'm going to say, hey, I want the field path and protocols, which means I want to know what the path is on VMS, what the protocols are that are enabled for that view, and I can go through and execute that. And this will give me on this particular cluster all of the views that we have, along with the protocols that they are exposed in. And I can call these out if I want to get additional fields. I can call additional fields for this. Like let's say I wanted to say, hey, I want to know what the view policy is for this. Well, I'm not sure what the API says for this, so let's take a look at the API interface here. So we're going to look for views. I'm going to say I want to do a list views here, and I want to get for this, and it's actually going to be policy name for this. So I can go through and show policy ID or policy name I can get. So if I do policy name protocols, we're going to go through and be able to get, no, it doesn't like that. We'll go and get policy ID off of that. That'll give me the view policy ID. And if I want to look at one of these, I can go through and look at the policy ID and get that information there. So again, very powerful. The nice advantage here is that I am running this on a different system. I don't have to go through, I don't have to connect up to the C node directly. I don't have to log into the C node directly. I can run this off my desktop system, off another Linux system. I can script against this. It's also useful for, again, for cluster administrators as well as tenant administrators. So with that, let's go through and let's spend the rest of the time here looking at the GUI itself. Okay. So let's talk about the GUI here. So I'm going to go through, I'm going to look at the GUI. So we're going to start here with the cluster admin and then go through and look at the tenant admin, how that's a little bit different. So when we go through, we log in, we just hit one of the VMS IP address, or the VMS host name, as we have it defined here. I get presented with my login window, and I log in with my admin user and admin password and my credentials that I wish to use. And I get this, and I go through and I get this, this initial dashboard screen. Now, the dashboard screen here gives you information about the cluster itself, tells me the name of the cluster, tells me the software release that it is running on, tells me if there's any current running activities that are running, any alarms that are on the cluster, and then gives you this initial dashboard here. Talks about our capacity in here, both in usable, meaning the physical capacity, or the logical capacity, overall data reduction, tells us how much is used, how much is free, how much is an auxiliary, which is space that is pending deletions or tied up within snapshots. Gives us an overview of the quick performance numbers. There's not much going on in this particular cluster right now, but I can look at that, whether it be I/O or replication or database traffic. We can see those there. It gives me an inventory of this particular cluster, which means how many C nodes I have, how many D nodes that I have, how many SSDs and SCMs I have, and then some performance metrics for this. Now, there also is with this is new with 5.3, is that we have a tenants dashboard as well. Now, the tenants dashboard gives me an overview from, again, a very high level as to what's going on this cluster based on tenant IO. So we have default. Default is the default tenant on the cluster that exists on all clusters anyways, even if you're not using multi-tenancy. And then it breaks it out based on the tenants that are out there. For that, in terms of the capacity and what kind of data reduction each one of those tenants there is getting, gives us the bandwidth for those tenants. And this is going to be historical bandwidth that they have there. Again, not much going on in this particular cluster, so not much interesting happening here. And then latency for any individual tenant, and then also the number of IOPS for those tenants. So it gives a cluster administrator the ability to say, hey, what's going on with all my tenants without having to dig very deep into the metrics. When we look at the infrastructure page gives us, again, a little more details as to, how many C nodes we have in the cluster, what version of software and hardware those C nodes are running for that, what the D nodes are within the cluster, gives us an overview of the total of SSDs that we have within the cluster here, where they're attached to. If I want to go through and get a graphical representation as to where particular devices are, I can click on hardware layout, and it'll tell me, okay, for that particular, for this particular slot location, this is the SSD that is in there, and I can go through and do things like turn on LEDs and so on and so forth. So it gives us a hardware representation if we need to go through and make use of that. We can also go through from this interface for things like C nodes and D nodes. We can go through and we can activate and deactivate and power on and power off these different components as we need to go through and do that. So we can do that all from the GUI here. The infrastructure page also gives us the ability to go through and run things like cluster updates. So if I want to go through and I want to upgrade a cluster, I can go through and do an OS update on the cluster for not only the VAST software, but the underlying firmware and the underlying OS for those. So we can do that all from these screens here. I'm not going to run through a cluster upgrade for this. It takes a bit of time to go through and do. We're not going to do that here, but this is where you would go through and execute those. Looking through the rest of the features here for this, we have our element store. Element store is where most of the management is going to be done on a day-to-day basis. This is where we go through and we define things like our views and our view policies. So again, a view and a view policy are tied together. A view is effectively an export from the element store. We use the term view rather than the terms for the protocols, because if we're talking about a NFS export or an SMB share or an S3 bucket or an S3 endpoint or a database, those get a little bit cumbersome, especially when you start talking about multi-protocol. So we refer to those generically as a view. A view policy is something that controls how that view behaves. So how do we handle permissions? How do we handle some access controls with that? So those can all be defined within the element store portion here. If you are running 5.3, you're going through and you're using block storage, then we also have these areas to show the volumes that you have, or the block devices that are defined on the cluster here, as well as the hosts or the clients that are going through and accessing those. Because with block storage, we need to go through, we need to present filters and control how who has access to what from there. So we would see those here. If you're not using block storage, or you're not using, you're not yet on VAST 5.3, these will not show up. But as soon as you create some block storage there, they will show up on VAST 5.3. So don't be concerned if it's not missing. You're not missing anything there. It just doesn't appear until we actually have some block devices defined. Other areas, lifecycle rules to control S3 bucket behavior, as well as we can apply those to NFS and SMB shares as well. We can set our quotas for things to control how space is utilized, how large a view can grow, how much data a particular user can write to that view, and then things like our quality of service policies as well, where we control network throughput to the different views or for different users. And lastly, our tenants. And I'll circle back to tenants here in just a moment here. We define our tenancy under the element store page. Network access gives us information about our network configuration. So what VIP pools do we have defined on the cluster? What C nodes are those VIP pools using for those? How many ports are there? How many IP addresses are in those VIP pools? I can go through, I can look at the distribution of those VIPs and what C node those reside in. So I have my main VIP pool here with IP addresses 1 through 6, and it's spread out over the C nodes that I have configured in this particular cluster today. We got our VAST DNS service. This is a service, a DNS resolver that will resolve the IP addresses for the VIP pools in there and do it in such a fashion to give us some load balancing across the C nodes. And then BGP, if we're going through and we're making use of the BGP with level 3, this is a new feature with 5.3. We can go through and define this. I don't have any configurations here for that, but we can define those there. We have data protection. Data protection controls things like replication, controls where we go through and which clusters are we replicating to, what our protected paths and protected policies are. So what data are we replicating or making snapshots with? What are the protection policies we're using? How are we scheduling those policies for those? How often are we doing snapshots? How often are we replicating those for that? We can talk about manually created snapshots, or when I want to create clones of those snapshots, we can create our global clones from here as well. User management is where we define our providers. So what is our Active Directory providers that we have defined in the cluster itself? What are LDAP providers that we're making use of? If I have S3 identity policies, this is where we create my S3 identity policies for different users. So if I want to take a look at what somebody is allowed to do for S3, I can go through and define my rules here. So this is actually a database rule here for this. So we can go through and we can define those all from here. With 5.3, you have the notion of a local provider, which is locally defined users are going to be used for within different tenants. We create those here. And then our user management for either creating local users or going through and looking up users to go through and assign identity policy and identity keys to those, as well as being able to do that from groups. We have our database. Database covers not only locally defined databases here that you've created here, but also things like the VAST catalog and autolog. Now, these are not enabled on this particular cluster right now, but we'll be able to go through and administer those from here. We have our analytics. The VMS is responsible for managing all the analytics, so it's very, very, very powerful. We can see all of our analytics here for this here, down to cluster bandwidth, look at individual C nodes, look at individual SSDs, look at individual users, or based on tenant. We can get all of these from this. Alarms and events gives us any activities, any alarms that we need to be aware of, any activities that have been happening on the cluster. We took a C node online, offline, we deleted snapshots, those will be recorded in here, along with controls around what events do we want to notify on, as well as webhooks are defined in here. Activities gives us a state of any long-running activities or any modifications that are going on in the cluster. We'll see those within these screens here. We have hardware layout, and then we have our administrators and settings. So I'll talk about administrators just a second here. We'll go into settings here. These are where all our cluster-wide settings are set for this, including things like, hey, do I want to display things in base 10 or base 2 within the GUI for this? We can go through and define those error message of the day, along with other rules related. Do I want to have auditing enabled? Do I want to have the VAST catalog enabled? Those types of items are done here. So let's touch briefly then on the administrator side here. So I did already talk about this very briefly. The administrators here, we've got administrators within VAST are referred to as managers. So we have locally defined managers, and these are the managers that I can go through and define here. And I can create these managers to allow for system administration. So provide a username, provide a password. I have the ability to go through and set temporary passwords that will force a manager to go through and change the password upon the first login. Again, this is just for locally defined. So you can send them out an email, say, hey, you've been created, here's your temporary password, change it when you log in. You can also go through and set expiry rules and so forth. But when we create the local managers, we need to define, is this manager going to be a cluster admin that has rights to the entirety of the cluster, or just a tenant admin? So we define those. And then from here, we can define, we can say which tenant someone has access to for those there. And we can do the role assignment from here if we wish to go through and assign roles to this tenant or use this manager when we create them. Again, talked here about some of the RBAC controls that we have here. So I've got a few different RBAC controls here for this. If I want to create new roles for these here, we define, is this role related to tenant admins? If it's related to cluster admins, if it's related to a tenant admin, I have to go through and select which tenant this applies to. But when I go through and create these different roles, we can select the realm that I want to allow them access to, and then what kind of rights I want to do. So if I want to do just a view-only user that has the ability just to log in and look at things, I would create a role that just has view. But if I also want them to be able to do different things, I can go through and I can say, let's say I want to allow them to edit existing things, but not be able to create new logical instances like new views or things. I just want them to be able to edit existing ones and not delete them. We could allow somebody or create a role that would look something like this. And then for here, we can assign our Active Directory or LDAP groups if we wish. Realms here, again, if I want to be a little more granular for some of these realms, because when I look at something like the logical realm encompasses a whole bunch of things. It encompasses not only VIPs, but also views and VIP pools and lifecycle quotas and protected paths and a whole bunch of different things. And that is probably a little more broad than you may want. So again, we can restrict things a little bit further with these custom realms if we choose to go through and create those. And once I create a custom realm, it shows up as a realm. I can select and define a role. One item I did mention, haven't mentioned yet, is that we do support single sign-on for this. So if you have a provider like Shibboleth or some of the other ones like Okta that provides you with single sign-on and does it through SAML, we can go through and you can use those single sign-on providers to provide administrative access into the VAST cluster. This doesn't affect data access. This is just strictly for administrative access, so we support things there. So let's touch very briefly on, as we're kind of wrapping up the time here. Let's talk briefly on, again, the difference between a cluster admin and a tenant admin. So we already have our cluster administrators here. Let's talk about the tenant admins very, very briefly and how we access those. So within the administrators there, again, when we create a local manager, we can go through, we can define them as either a tenant admin or a cluster admin. Within the tenants, when we create our tenants here have the ability to go through, and actually let me add an existing tenant because it's a little more interesting when I look at that. We have the ability to go through and say, for access management, how do I want to go through and how do I want to allow access into this tenant here? Do I want to use just local managers, which means they're going to be something defined on the cluster side, or do I want to use an administrator group from one of the providers that I want to go through and use, where I can say, hey, I want to use the Unix group or something like that. Anyone in the Unix group can administer this particular tenant. So we can go through and set those here to define that. Very like what we do with the roles on the cluster admin side, we can say which users have the ability to administer a particular tenant. There's also options to filter who can go through and administer a tenant based on their client IP address. But once we have those kind of rules defined, we're going to allow a user to log in as a tenant administrator here. So how do we access that? Tenant administrators don't use the same URL. They actually use a different URL to log in, and that different URL is listed or it's defined as part of the tenant creation script. So I can look at the tenant and say, this is the URL that they use. And you see it has the tenant name defined as part of it. Now, this tenant name will default to the actual tenant name, but if I want to go through and I want to make it something different, so let's say you're a CSP, and rather than having a UID or UUID that you use in your tenant creation name, there you actually want to say, hey, I want this to be Spacely Sprockets or VAST Customer Training or VCT Unlimited or something like that, we can go through and put things there. So if I say I want to call this VCT Unlimited, as a company, it would change that URL so that would be what you would use to log in. Okay, so I'm not going to make any changes here, but let's look at how things are presented here. So I'm going to call out, I've got an incognito window up. I'm going to go through and connect up to this tenant 1 here. So I call up an incognito window, again, because there's cookies and it's common VMS. So VMS, you don't want to have to get confused as to whether you're talking as a tenant admin or cluster admin here. So we log in, we're going to go here, we're going to hit that URL with the tenant name. We see here that we connect up that this is the tenant that we have. There's no way for someone accessing VMS to browse the tenants without actually logging in to see what tenants are on the cluster. So they have to know the name of the tenant and use that specific URL to log in. But we're going to go through it and log in here. We have to use a tenant administrator. So if I go through and I try to log in as my admin user, my cluster admin user, it is not going to allow me to go through and log in. It's going to go through and give me an error and say, hey, I don't know who you are. It's not going to allow me to log in. Likewise, if I were to try to use a tenant admin to use on the cluster URL, it wouldn't allow me to do that. But I'm going to use my tenant admin here. Tenant admin 1 is the name of the user that I defined. Again, I defined that administrator over here. It's defined right there. But I'm going to go through and log in here as that administrator, and I get presented as a tenant administrator, a very similar but different interface from what a cluster admin would see. So I see on here, I see things from my tenant. I will see the name of the tenant. I don't see the name of the cluster because it's not relevant to the tenant. I see the version of VAST software it's running now, and I see things related to that tenant. I see the total capacity for that tenant itself. I see any views that are top views that are created. There's again not much activity going on here, but I see things in a tenant context. I still have the ability to go through and do things like create different views and create my own view policies, but certain things I'm not going to be able to go through and do. If I go through and I look here, I'm missing the tab here that would allow me to go through and create things like VIP pools. Same thing with user management. I'm able to go through and I'm able to create identity policies. I'm able to query for users. I'm able to query for groups for these. But these users and groups I don't have the ability to go through and attach to Active Directory. Those are defined at the cluster level, not at the tenant level. But other functionality here in terms of things like being able to create databases. If I had catalog and auditing enabled, I would be able to see the VAST catalog in the context of the tenant, or the audit log in the context of the tenant, not cluster-wide, just tenant-wide for this. I'm able to look at analytics here, including things like data flow, but data flow here is only going to be related to I/O activity done to my particular tenant. Same thing with alarms and events. They'd be filtered for just the types of events and activities that are related to that tenant. As an tenant administrator, I can create a local manager for this. So if I delegate this, I can assign another person to be able to manage my tenant if I wish to go through locally. For that, I can again create some custom roles if I wish to go through and define some custom roles for that particular tenant as well, but only in the context of my tenant. So it gives you the ability to delegate responsibility or delegate authority to specific groups, specific individuals, but still having controls around those. So very, very powerful. So with that, that covers a lot of ground with VMS. How you go through and access it, how you go through and use it, where the different areas are. Let's take a look if we have any Q&A questions here for these.
One interesting one we wanted you to answer live. There's a question: can you add multiple clusters to one tenant?
Yeah. So when we're talking about multiple clusters in one tenant, that taking the question at face value, no, because a tenant exists on a cluster. It's not the tenant does not span multiple clusters. However, going a little bit deeper, if we are talking about having a tenant on cluster A and a tenant on cluster B, those function, as two separate entities. Those are two separate setups. They are independent of each other, but we can go through and set up as like a tenant administrator can go through and set up replication between those to go through and replicate between the two different tenants. So a tenant can't span a cluster directly, but you can have two tenants on two different clusters that do have relationships with each other in terms of replication and global namespace and all of the other good things that we can go through and do for that. But a tenant itself exists on one cluster, it doesn't span two different clusters. So they're two separate management entities with that.
All right.
Okay, let's see here. Yep. So that is all the questions that I see on there. There was another one related to 16C nodes for that. Again, that does happen automatically. VMS will go through and automatically allocate one of those C nodes for that. When you're working with sizing your VAST cluster, the sales team is aware of this, and we'll take that into account when we're going through and sizing things to make sure you're not losing resources for that or losing IO performance just based on that limitation.
Awesome.
Right.
And then I just put in the chat a link to today's slides. And then also, as I mentioned at the beginning of our webinar, we have our user conference coming up in February. And so I put a link to where you can check that out and register for it. There is going to be a lot of training that came through. Oh, it looks like now we do have a few new questions that just popped in there, Phil. So we've got, can you tell us which version of VMS you demoed? Someone thinks their screen looks a little different.
Right. Yeah. So the version that I did all these demos on is VAST 5.3, specifically 5.3. Let's see, what are we looking at here? Hold on a sec here. 5.3.2. So it is one of the releases of 5.3 for that. So your screen will look a little bit different for some of those. Really, the big difference between 5.3 and earlier versions is that is the tenant administrator screens. Everything else should pretty much be very similar. For that, we have been going through and updating the GUI, from release to release. So depending on how far you back, there may be significant changes between those, but generally they're going to be very, very similar. For 5.2 and 5.1 are going to be very similar for that.
Awesome. Okay. And then the other question was about the recording. So I just put in the chat, we have a playlist on YouTube, on the VAST YouTube channel, that is specific to customer webinar recordings that we do. So if you go there, you will see the playlist of all of the recordings, and this one will be up in like the next 24 to 48 hours. There is also another playlist of short tutorials there. So for anyone who just wants, like the 5-minute video of how to do one very specific thing in VMS, that's another great resource there as well. So with that, I think we like to end class a few minutes early. So we will thank you all for being with us, and please join us next time. We'll be going through setting up S3 in the VAST management system. So we would love to be able to have you there for that. Oh, let's see. Oh, there's another one. Phil, we just got more questions. It says 5.3. any performance enhancements for 5 versus
5.3
5.
does contain several performance enhancements on things. It's probably a little more detailed question than we have time to around that. We're always striving to make performance improvements just based on software in terms of how we handle incoming I/O, how we do back-end layout for that. If you have interest in knowing what the specific changes are, I would recommend that you talk to your sales team. For those, they can give you much more in-depth information as to the difference between 5.2 and 5.3 than we're going to have time with to go through today.
Okay, and I am going to put in the chat too. We did a webinar on 5.3 that might be helpful just for a brief overview. So I added that to the chat as well.
Okay.
All righty. Thank you all for joining us, and we will hope to see you next time.
Thanks, everyone. See you next time.